conversations about the state of ocean acidification science in the Southeast region. These webinars are intended to create a dialogue among scientists to identify what is known, what isn't, and what research in other regions of the United States can be applied to better understand ocean acidification and its impacts in this region. It's hoped that with this information, webinar participants will be able to collaborate to better understand and adapt to ocean acidification moving forward. I'm Paula Keener with NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research and a member of the SOCAN Steering Committee, and I'll be moderating today's session. Jennifer Bennett-Mintz, Education and Outreach Coordinator for NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, is also on the line with me today and will be helping to facilitate today's session. During the presentation, all audience members will be in listen-only mode. You're welcome to type questions related to technical issues or questions for the presenter into the questions box at the bottom of the GoToMeeting panel on the right-hand corner of your screen. Jennifer and I will be moderating incoming questions, and we will respond to them or pose them to our speaker. We are also recording this session, and a video recording and a PDF of the presentation will be available on the SOCAN website. We are very excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. Kim Yates. Kim is a senior research scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey Coastal and Marine Science Center in St. Petersburg, Florida. Her research currently focuses on the effect of ocean acidification on coral reef health and growth, estuarine ecosystems, and natural ocean acidification refuges for marine organisms. So Kim, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you.
Okay, I think I have it. Can you hear me, Paula?
Roger that.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining today, and thank you to SOCAN for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about coral reefs in our region. And as soon as I can get this to activate, we will move forward. Okay, there we go. I have a lot of material to cover for you guys today, and so I'm going to start out by giving you a brief overview of coral reef basics that are relevant for our discussion of ocean acidification today. And then I want to spend a little bit of time setting the stage and talking about the current threats to coral reefs and the existing baseline of reef health that ocean acidification is impacting in our region. Then I'll talk a little bit about the effects of ocean acidification on coral reef community metabolism and some of the long-term implications for coral reefs and specifically reef structure. And then I'll go through some results from some recent studies on ecosystem level responses of coral reefs to ocean acidification in our region. Coral reefs provide a number of ecosystem services. Many of these, most of you are probably familiar with. Some of them are not so obvious. First and foremost, coral reefs provide fish habitat for one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems in the ocean. They also provide a major source of food, especially for some of our developing nations in the Caribbean. Reefs serve as a natural barrier along the coastline and actually protect coastlines from storm waves and tsunamis. As reefs grow,
the broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Paula, I have a question for you. I just said that the broadcast is now starting, so have I started this too soon? Do I need to back up?
Kimberly, Jen, we're getting no audio.
Okay,
yeah, so Kim, go ahead and back up if you wouldn't mind. Yep.
Okay, so I'm assuming everyone missed the introductory remarks. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay, so let's start over. Sorry about that, gang. All right, so this is the outline for our talk today. I have a lot of material to cover, and I apologize if some of you have already heard this on audio. I'm going to begin by giving you an overview of some of the coral reef basics, Coral Reefs 101, that are relevant to our discussion of ocean acidification today. And then I want to spend a little bit of time sort of setting the stage and talking about current threats to coral reefs and the existing baseline of reef health that ocean acidification is affecting in our region. Then I'll talk about the effects of ocean acidification on coral reef community metabolism and what that means with respect to long-term implications for both coral reefs and coral reef structure. And then I'll go through some results from some recent studies on ecosystem level responses of coral reefs to ocean acidification. So coral reefs provide a variety of ecosystem services. Some of these you are familiar with, and some of these may not be so obvious. First and foremost, coral reefs provide fish habitat for one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems in the ocean. They're also a major source of food, especially for some of our developing nations in the Caribbean. Coral reefs serve as natural barriers along the coastline and actually protect coastlines from storm waves and tsunamis. And as coral reefs grow and carbonate structures degrade, they actually produce sand for many of our beaches. Coral reefs provide a number of pharmaceuticals, such as anti-inflammatories, some pain medications, and anti-carcinogens. And then we all know that they're a source of many recreational activities, such as fishing and diving. And corals also provide a mechanism for long-term storage of carbon through production of calcium carbonate. These ecosystem services support a number of different jobs and businesses that are at risk in our region from ocean acidification. This information actually comes from a pamphlet that was put together by the Ocean Conservancy for a recent Florida Ocean Acidification Roundtable meeting that was held at Mote Marine in Sarasota in September of this year. So recreational coral reef diving, fishing, and viewing of coral reefs generates about $60 billion in local sales in our state, and supports about $2.8 billion in local income. That supports about 70,000 jobs in Florida, and this also supports a long line of what we call downstream industries. So for example, marinas, hotels, restaurants, gift shops, and other businesses that are along coral reef coastlines. All of these ecosystem services depend on the ability of coral reefs to produce these three-dimensional structures. This is a very generalized diagram of coral calcification. This is a coral polyp, and at the base of these polyps there are very specialized cells called calicoblastic cells. Between these cells, or the outer layer of this tissue, there's a small fluid between the cell, the animal, and the carbonate basal plate that it sits on. And this is where the calcium carbonate is actually produced. These cells actually pump the chemical constituents into this space that are required for development of the carbonate mineral structure. And you can see that carbonate combines with calcium to form calcium carbonate, which forms that mineral skeleton. And this process very much depends on the production and pumping of both hydrogen ions and carbonate ions that are both affected by ocean acidification. So it's this coral calcification process that creates this three-dimensional structure of coral reefs. For some reason my buttons are not responding to changes. There we go. All right, this calcification process is a reversible process. So this is a balanced equation of the reaction for calcification. There's our carbonate, there's our calcium, and we create calcium carbonate. But this reaction can be reversed so that you actually get carbonate dissolution. So if you add CO2 to the reaction and water, it can cause calcium carbonate to dissolve back into its constituents. And you can also get dissolution of carbonates by decreasing carbonate ion concentration or mineral saturation state, which is based on carbonate ion concentration. Coral reefs form very slowly over thousands of years through this process of biogenic calcifications. As marine organisms calcify, they create these massive structures of carbonate skeletons. Over time, as the organisms grow and die, these skeletons break down and produce carbonate sediment. This carbonate sediment fills in the reef framework and eventually becomes cemented, and that allows the upward vertical accretion of coral reefs. So that's how they grow. In 1988, Budemeyer and Smith summarized reef accretion rates from a variety of different papers and methods and compared those to sea level rise. So for example, they looked at linear growth rates of individual coral species. They looked at accumulation rates of reefs from the post-glacial Holocene in the geologic record. And then they also looked at calcification rates using a chemical proxy that we call the alkalinity anomaly technique, or alkalinity depression. And you can see that during this time, reefs were generally keeping up with rising sea level. This is very important. Shallow water reefs have to keep up with rising sea level because they contain photosynthetic organisms in their tissues and so need to stay where they can reach enough light to help them grow. But keeping up with rising sea level depends very much on this balance between calcification and chemical dissolution of carbonates. We also call this chemical erosion. It also depends on other types of erosion in addition to chemical erosion, like physical erosion and biological erosion, and how much sediment is exported from the system. Depends on coral reef accumulation rates. They have to be accumulating fast enough to keep up with the rise of sea level. And so the bottom line, the end game, is that calcification and accumulation has to exceed erosion and transport in order for these reefs to keep up. And this very much depends on healthy corals and other calcifying organisms on the reef. So we all know that coral reefs around the world are threatened. This is a picture of a coral head from Grecian rocks in the Florida Keys in 1961. This is the same coral head in 1988 and again in 2001. So you can see that over time, over the last few decades, we've had an enormous amount of loss of reef structure, and we see this transition to these algal-dominated communities. And in fact, the abundance of reef-building corals has decreased over 80% since the 1970s on Florida and Caribbean reefs. And so we're seeing this transition from these ecosystems that were dominated by calcification and are now becoming dominated by production of organic carbon. Reef degradation over the past couple decades has been attributed primarily to the local stressors, and I like to call these guys the local villains. You're probably familiar with most of these. Pollution is obvious. Overfishing causes problems, particularly overfishing of herbivorous fish that keep the algae mode back on these reefs. Terrestrial runoff of sediments is important. Not only can it bury and suffocate corals, but also it carries contaminants along with it very often. This might be overkill on this particular slide, but physical damage is important. And yes, there are some places in the world where people still use dynamite to fish on reefs, but in our area we're talking mostly about anchor damage and physical breakage due to recreational and fishing activities. All of these stressors can lead to coral disease. And then we have the global stressors, or what I like to call the global villains. And these have really been considered emerging threats. And what we're talking about is those threats caused by elevated atmospheric CO2. And for the chemists in the crowd, you might recognize these little guys as CO2 molecules. So these are our global villains for the story today. So we're talking about global warming and ocean acidification. The IPCC AR5 report projects that 33 to 66% of the world's coral reefs are subject to long-term degradation in the next few decades due only to climate-driven impacts, solar or thermal stress, meaning elevated temperature, light, and UV radiation, and ocean acidification. So a little bit on thermal stress, or global warming basics. If water gets about 1 or 2 degrees Celsius higher than summertime averages, then corals can get stressed and bleach. This is a picture down here showing a healthy coral that has its algal symbionts with it, and when they bleach, they expel their symbionts, and you get this translucent tissue color that looks white because you can see the underlying carbonate skeleton. Elevated light and UV can actually increase thermal stress and bleaching. And this is a graph from some work by Derek Manzello published in 2015. This shows mean seawater temperature from 1987 through 2014. This red line is a thermal stress threshold that was developed at Molasses Reef from some temperature records there. And you can see that since 1987, we've had 6 major Keys-wide bleaching episodes. And between 2006 and 2013, we've actually had moderate bleaching every single year except for 1. And so annual bleaching is expected to occur as early as 2020 in the Florida Keys. High temperatures and bleaching also can leave corals more vulnerable to disease. This is a picture from Marilyn Brandt at the, well, she's at the University of Virgin Islands now. She was in Miami. This shows the stages of both bleaching and then coral disease, the progression over about 1 month in 2005. So you can see that the coral starts bleaching and disease sets in because it has become much more vulnerable to disease. So this can very quickly kill part or all of the coral colony. By 1998, 82% of the coral monitoring stations, there were about 160 in the Florida Keys, were affected by coral disease. Bioerosion also causes loss of reef structure. Once these corals become susceptible to disease and bleaching and begin to die, these areas of dead coral are much more vulnerable to bioerosion. And that's when various animals and microorganisms can actually go in and eat away or wear away at the coral's limestone structure and their tissues. This results both in loss of reef structure and function. So here's another picture from 1959 of a coral head in the Coral Keys and the same coral head in 1998. And this is very much what the current baseline of reef health looks like in most areas in the Atlantic and Caribbean. So this is what we're starting with. We see these transitions from these coral-dominated communities to communities dominated very much by production of organic carbon and much less calcification. Because of this, one of the ways that we can measure reef health is in terms of what we call coral reef community metabolism. And so this is that balance that we're talking about between net ecosystem production or organic carbon gains and net ecosystem calcification or inorganic carbon gains. And so what we're talking about is the balance between what we call primary reef functions. So photosynthesis, respiration, calcification, and dissolution. So the question that we want to come back to then is, how is ocean acidification anticipated to impact coral reef community metabolism? Many of you who have been joining our webinars have probably seen a slide like this showing ocean acidification basics. I'm going to walk through this again and specifically point out what's relevant for our discussion with respect to coral specifically. So ocean acidification occurs as elevated atmospheric CO2 equilibrates with the surface water of the ocean. CO2 then combines with water and produces carbonic acid. That causes a decrease in ocean pH. Carbonic acid can also further dissociate into bicarbonate ions and carbonate ions, and these are what we call the primary dissolved inorganic carbon species in the ocean. This dissociation reaction is very much pH dependent, so at higher pH you have carbonate ions, and remember that's one of the things that's really important for coral calcification. But as pH decreases, you get a decrease in carbonate ion concentration and you get more bicarbonate and carbonic acid. This system is relatively easy to characterize. We can measure two of what we call 4 carbonate system parameters. So we can measure one of these or 2 of these 4 parameters and calculate this entire speciation and much of the chemistry associated with ocean acidification. And in fact, there's a growing body of literature that shows that coral reef community calcification rates are directly dependent on carbonate ion concentration. This is one of the classic graphs from some early work by Chris Langdon that was done in the Biosphere 2. You can see community calcification rates on this axis, and you can see decreasing carbonate ion concentrations here, and you get a linear decrease in calcification rate with carbonate ion concentration. The 0 line is here, if you can see my pointer moving back and forth. So numbers less than 0 indicate dissolution. Numbers greater than 0 indicate growth. So you can see at some point we actually begin to get dissolution as carbonate ion concentrations decrease. And so that means that we actually have a lot of what we call OA losers on the reef. So not just corals, but other things like calcareous algae, forams, various echinoderms, and shellfish are susceptible to this as well. So calcium carbonate production rates are actually estimated to decrease by as much as 60% by mid-century. Ocean acidification also increases carbonate dissolution, and there's actually kind of a double whammy effect going on here. So calcification itself, this is the reaction that I showed you earlier, actually produces CO2, decreases carbonate ion concentration, and decreases pH. So coral calcification alone can actually exacerbate ocean acidification conditions. And it also causes carbonate dissolution. Again, this is that reverse reaction. So this can be bad for corals if they're subject to dissolution. However, if you get dissolution of carbonate sediments, you can actually consume the CO2 in the reaction, that's there, increase carbonate ion concentration, and you can actually buffer pH. So again, we have some losers in this situation, but carbonate dissolution may also help buffer pH in some instances. OA can also increase photosynthesis. This is a photosynthesis reaction. You have CO2 and water, and you get a little bit of sugar and oxygen. And Palacios and Zimmerman in 2007 showed that seagrasses actually increase photosynthesis and reduce light requirements with increased PCO2 in the water. And for macroalgae, they actually show a 52% increase in growth at 2 times atmospheric CO2. And so we actually have some winners with respect to ocean acidification. So things like various types of seagrasses and algae will actually benefit from ocean acidification. Ocean acidification also increases susceptibility to coral bleaching. This is a slide that is courtesy of Aaron Mueller at Mote Marine, some work done by Ken Anthony et al. In 2008, showing that bleaching actually increases with ocean acidification, both for coral species and coral and algae. However, some work by Aaron Mueller shows that low pH can actually reduce the progression of black band disease. So you get fewer lesion or slower lesion progress at lower pH in certain coral species. And it also reduces the virulence of coral and algae disease as well. This is some more work by Aaron Mueller. So with ocean acidification, we may actually see an increase in coral bleaching, but a decrease in infectious disease in both coral and algae and corals. And so we're not really sure at this point whether or not there will be an increase in infectious disease as coral bleaching increases in the future with respect to ocean acidification. Ocean acidification also increases rates of bioerosion. This is some work by Anne Triboulet in 2009, and at 2 times pre-industrial atmospheric CO2, eudendolithic algae actually dissolve about 50% more carbonate. So the long-term implications for the future of both reef function and structure are probably beginning to become apparent. We're going to see a lot less reefs that looks like this and a lot more reefs that look like this. We're getting this transition from dominance of calcification to production of organic carbon as the dominant process on these reefs. So one of the ways that we try to quantify these effects is we use what we call an integrated seascape approach, or an integrated reefscape approach in this particular circumstance, to look at the impacts of climate change on ocean acidification and coral reefs. So what we do is we integrate and synchronize research on the chemistry, the physical environment and processes, and the biology and biogeochemical cycling on reefs to try to get an ecosystem level picture of how ocean acidification is affecting these systems. This is one example of some of the work that we've been doing over the past several years. We've been using this approach to measure community level calcification and dissolution rates on coral reefs. We combine things like mesocosm studies using these chambers that sit on the seafloor. These are actually about the size of a large full-size pickup truck. We use these kinds of chambers to trap water over the seafloor, over various kinds of coral communities and associated communities, and then measure changes in the water chemistry over time. And then we can use a lot of those chemical parameters as proxies to calculate things like community calcification and dissolution and photosynthesis and respiration. And then we combine that with long-term monitoring of the chemical environment so that we can look at how these biological processes change in response to the chemical environment. We've done this type of work at a variety of different study sites in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Caribbean, including in the Florida Keys, U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Florida Bay, and also in Hawaii. And this is an example of what some of that kind of data look like. So if you look at this bottom graph, you can see PCO2 as the blue line and total alkalinity as the red line. And that's one of the chemical proxies that we use for calcification. So you can see that as PCO2 increases, usually during the night, you also see an increase in total alkalinity. And increasing total alkalinity is an indication of dissolution of carbonates. And as PCO2 decreases during the day, you also see a decrease in total alkalinity as you're getting calcification. This red line here indicates a little over 500 microatmospheres of PCO2 in the water, and so you can see that during the night, the water column actually gets elevated well above 500 microatmospheres of PCO2. So if you look at these numbers on the data points on the total alkalinity line in red, those correspond to the calcification rates calculated from the alkalinity values on the top graph on the left in the red line here. And again, you can see that during the day, we get net production of carbonate above the zero line as positive numbers, and during the night, we get dissolution of calcium carbonate indicated by the negative numbers below the line. So we can use this type of data to calculate what we call dissolution thresholds. So if we plot rates of calcification versus PCO2 and carbonate ion concentration, we can begin to tease out what we call PCO2 and carbonate ion thresholds for dissolution. So again, here's the zero line, and positive numbers indicate calcification, negative numbers indicate dissolution. And you can see dissolution begins happening, in this case, at over 500 microatmospheres of PCO2 and at about 181 micromoles of carbonate ion concentration. So dissolution occurs when the seawater PCO2 is greater than the PCO2 threshold, and the carbonate ion concentration is less than the carbonate ion concentration threshold. And if we look at the dissolution thresholds in the areas of our study, here's PCO2, here's carbonate ion concentration, you can see that they're pretty variable. This is the average of all of the study sites that we've been working in, and this variation is due to things like community composition, seasonal variations in calcification rates, different sediment compositions with respect to the carbonate minerals especially, biological control on calcification, and also water mass residence time. So in this particular instance, though, we're showing that on average, the PCO2 threshold for these study sites is about 584 microatmospheres and carbonate ion concentration of 208 micromoles, and that corresponds to a saturation state of about 3.1. So even though these are variable, these dissolution thresholds are variable, if you begin to plot these kinds of thresholds from a variety of places around the world, you can see that there is some emerging evidence for dissolution thresholds. This graph shows aragonite saturation state in this red line, predicted out to 2100. That's some data from Joni Klapis. And if you plot our average threshold, which is this black dot right here, and also this green dot, which represents the threshold calculated from a modeling study of about 9,000 different reef locations around the world. Also some work from the Shiraho Reef and also work from the Biosphere 2. You can see these beginning to converge in a fairly narrow band. And that threshold range is about 3.0 to 3.2 on the saturation state, and about 520 to 600 parts per million of CO2. And so we think that this might be what we call the calcification dissolution tipping point. And this is expected to occur around the year 2050 to 2060. We can also take this kind of data and calculate reef accumulation rates and look at those relative to sea level rise, much like Budemeyer and Smith did back in 1988. So if we take our data and look at dissolution and calcification rates, you can see that in some of these places, up to 80% of the carbonate that's produced during the day is actually dissolved during the night. So there's already a very much sediment dissolution already occurring. And then if you look at those accumulation rates relative to sea level rise, which is this lower graph, these red locations are the study sites that I've been showing you. You can see that many reefs are not keeping up with sea level rise, and none of our Caribbean sites are keeping up with sea level rise. And remember that this does not take into consideration the fact that ocean acidification increases dissolution and decreases calcification. This is what's happening right now. This is some work that Chris Langdon is doing in cooperation with NOAA, and these slides are courtesy of Chris. The NOAA ocean acidification test bed that's located at Chica Rocks in the Florida Keys has been measuring water chemistry, including PCO2, since about December of 2011. So this graph shows PCO2 in the water from 2011 to 2015, and you can see that during the winter months and the fall months, CO2 actually far exceeds 500 parts per million. And if you look at calcification and dissolution at that particular site on Chica Rocks in the Florida Keys, you can see that this particular reef is already dissolving during the winter. Remember, here's your zero line. Positive numbers indicate calcification, negative numbers indicate dissolution. And so you're seeing several months where you're actually getting dissolution of that reef. And in fact, dissolution is occurring throughout the Florida Keys. This graph shows rates of calcification for reefs at these 7 locations. This is the Florida Keys. At these 7 locations throughout the Florida Keys, they correspond to these numbers here. And you can see that reefs are dissolving during the winter in all but 2 of the reefs that are located in the lower Florida Keys. Additionally, one of the confounding factors that we don't know much about at this point is that Florida is a carbonate platform that supports these reefs and the coastlines along them. So here's the Florida carbonate platform. This actually formed millions of years ago when sea level was much higher and the Florida Peninsula was covered by a shallow sea. Calcifying organisms created thick deposits of carbonate material, and that accreted into this carbonate platform. After sea level fell and the carbonate platform was exposed, karst topography, what we call karst topography, developed. In much of this Florida peninsula, the carbonate platform is covered by this karst topography, which basically are solution holes in the carbonate platform. And that creates what we call sort of a Swiss cheese subterranean geology. That karst topography is what forms most of Florida's sinkholes and aquifers and develops what we call leaky coastal margins. So karst topography and sinkholes form through a process that looks a lot like ocean acidification. So carbon dioxide combines with water in the atmosphere from rain. It falls on the carbonate that's exposed. It dissolves the carbonate to the point that it collapses and creates these sinkholes. So what we don't know is as atmospheric CO2 increases, whether or not this process will be exacerbated and actually create more sinkholes and actually increase the conduits for groundwater. This karst topography is what houses our Florida aquifer system and also houses our springs, many of which pop up off of the coastline and bring fresh water and any nutrients or contaminants that it might contain out to the reefs. So one of the things we don't know is how coastal acidification will affect these carbonate coastlines and groundwater flow, particularly to aquifers in our Florida reefs. So key points so far. Reefs were not predicted to start dissolving until about 2050 to 2060. The finding that reefs in the Florida and the Caribbean are already starting to dissolve, even if only for part of the year, is very surprising and alarming. The effects of coastal ocean acidification on carbonate platforms are unknown, but are of a particular concern because of our leaky coastal margins. And the primary point is that the threat of ocean acidification in Florida and the Caribbean is not an emerging threat. It's already here. It's not a future threat. So there's a lot of doom and gloom there. So the question is there any hope? Will reefs keep up with rising sea level, or are they going to begin to erode away and become meccas of organic carbon production? There is some hope, in fact. In fact, seagrass turns out to be one of our superheroes. Seagrass photosynthesis can actually buffer ocean acidification. Here's an equation I showed you earlier, and photosynthesis actually consumes CO2, produces oxygen, and increases seawater pH. So for organisms to benefit from this, it depends